Okay, I guess I'll get started. So the topic for today's lecture is how to do the next homework, which is heuristic analysis. Hopefully everybody got their assignment in on time. And so what we're going to do next is give each person's assignment to two classmates. And then what you're going to do for the next homework is evaluate the systems, and you're going to use a specific set of guidelines that I'm going to talk about today. And then everybody's required to turn in that assignment on time as well. And so next Monday, everybody will turn in their evaluations of each other, and then we're going to give them back to you. And so you'll get two people's evaluations. And then the final assignment will be just to fix up your system based on the feedback. Okay, so typically this is a lot of fun. Everyone loves to criticize each other, and it's always interesting to see what sort of problems people, have left in their systems, or what problems people find in your systems. And it also is a good exercise in terms of understanding design principles and how to try and incorporate some of these guidelines into your own work. If you need to contact the person whose assignment you have, on Blackboard we'll have everybody's name and email. So if you don't understand something or something seems to be broken, it's perfectly acceptable to email the person whose assignment you're working on and ask them what's going on, or if there's something you missed that that they should have done. So what is heuristic evaluation? Kind of a silly name. It's basically just evaluating an interface based on specific guidelines. And the term, and as well as the guidelines, were invented by this guy, Jakob Nielsen, who now has his own company, but at the time when he came up with these, he was at Sun Microsystems. And the general idea is an expert, which is what you guys are practicing to be, evaluates a system. So it's different than a user study. In a user study, you have some task, and the users do those particular tasks. And clearly, that's weird. Clearly, when you have a user doing a task, they can only do a very small amount of things. The goal with heuristic analysis is actually to cover the entire interface. But it's still pretty cheap and inexpensive, still pretty easy to do efficiently. However, it does depend on the evaluator's judgment. So you're going to try and decide to what extent the systems violate these rules or comply with them. It's called discount because it's cheap and quick. Nielsen did some studies where he tried to evaluate the cost of some of the problems that were found to a company compared to the cost of actually running the evaluation. And so he came up with these numbers that it's up to 50 times cheaper to do a heuristic analysis compared to waiting around and trying to fix the problems later, or doing a user study to find all these problems. So heuristic evaluation is a systematic inspection of the entire system. And as you'll see when you get your homework back, it's not at all unusual for different evaluators to come up with different issues. So it's useful to have multiple people evaluating the same interface. And the research also shows that trained evaluators do a much better job than, say, computer scientists or people who have never really learned anything about this. And again, Nielsen did another study where he gave some computer scientists the set of heuristics and an interface with some known problems, and they were only able to find about a fifth of the problems, whereas the trained people found almost 2/3 of them. So it's not at all unusual to get more experience, to do a better job at these kinds of things if you are an HCI expert. Now the problem is, or the result of this is typically a long list of problems, and hopefully you'll be able to find a long list of problems in each other's homeworks. But in real life, there's this question then of what do you do about all these problems? In a big interface with lots of pages, you could find hundreds of problems. And so one thing a heuristic analysis is not particularly good at is understanding the severity of all these problems, or how do you decide which ones really are barriers to users versus just nice things to fix if you have time. So that's one issue. Another issue is you get very different feedback from a user interface evaluation, a usability study like you did before, compared to this heuristic analysis list. And so you kind of need to really do both. So if you do these kind of charts, we saw this one, similar one before, that as you have more evaluators, they just find exactly the same problems that you already know about. And so if you do the cost-benefit analysis, then the optimum value is around 4. That after 4 people, the number of new problems you end up getting drops off dramatically. And it's also kind of obvious here that, at 4, you have already about 70% of the problems, and you really don't get very much more feedback from for more people. It's not very common to do 4 people, so we're doing 2 in this in this homework, and that's kind of typical. It's also not that unusual to just do 1. It's not good enough to use people who are on your team. I mean, hopefully you're applying these heuristics while you're doing design. So one of the important reasons to know these heuristics is so that you don't violate them, right? One of the requirements is having good error messages. So you're going to know that somebody's going to look for that, and you'll try to make sure all your error messages are useful, right? So it doesn't help for you guys to evaluate your own interfaces or for people to do it in the team, but lots of companies have a variety of HCI specialists, or you can bring in outside people to do this evaluation for you. So the methodology is pretty straightforward. Each evaluator goes through the whole interface. It's okay, in this case, for the evaluator to ask the designer questions. Like I said, if you don't understand things, you can go ahead and ask your colleagues. You typically would go through the interface multiple times to make sure you noticed everything. You can either go at once through guideline, or you can go through all 10 guidelines per page. We asked you guys to submit a README with this assignment so that the evaluators know, what you're going for, what part works, which buttons are supposed to work and not supposed to work. And so that's not at all unusual, and that would typically be done with the real evaluation as well, to supply your evaluators with scenarios, user assumptions, and that kind of thing. There are a lot of guidelines. For this assignment, we're using Nielsen's revised list, which has 10 guidelines in it. But if you look in the textbook in the back, there's this enormous list of guidelines based on their recommendations for things that you should do. Another nice thing about these guidelines is they never expire. Unlike a specific guideline that says, hyperlinks should always be underlined. Well, that used to be true, but that's not true anymore. On the other hand, the guidelines that we're going to talk about are very high level and should always be true, as long as people, are people. Nielsen looked at 60 of his old guidelines and found that 90% of them were still valid after 20 years. The people, still operate the same way. Some of them were relevant because the technologies they were referring to are no longer in use. Others, there were a couple that now have, gone a different way. And it's also true of web guidelines and other of these kinds of rules. So these are the 10 guidelines from Nielsen that you're going to use for this assignment. They're also discussed in the textbook in section 13.4. And I'm going to go through each of these in the rest of the lecture. But there are lots of other guidelines that you might use. I counted 202 guidelines in chapter 22. And some of these are very specific, some are really general. They're all useful, but obviously nobody's ever going to memorize all of these, and it'd be impossible to apply these to any system. In some future lectures, we're going to talk about some more guidelines. We're going to talk about specific guidelines for web interfaces, for international interfaces, for phone interfaces. So we'll also have a variety of other guidelines to talk about. Some of these are kind of fun, some are kind of silly, but there really are a lot of things that you might want to consider when you're trying to become an expert designer, trying to become a user interface specialist. I would say probably none of these are wrong. Provide clearly marked exits is one we'll actually be talking about. Be consistent. Use the same term. A lot of these are details of some of the other ones. They're kind of sub-guidelines. Decompose complex instructions into simpler parts. A lot of these seem like they're just common sense, but as you'll see, it's not at all unusual to violate them. Anybody see what the question said? Right. So somebody from Silicon Valley said heuristic analysis cannot be done by a naive person who doesn't know the guidelines. Obviously, that's one of the reasons for the lecture today, is to kind of introduce you to these guidelines, to understand what sort of reason that they apply and in what context you would want to use them. So anyway, I'm not going to read through all these. You're certainly encouraged to go look at them on your own and read that chapter if you want. So let's talk about the Nielsen guidelines. The first one is visibility of system status. So this encompasses a whole bunch of things around making sure the user always knows what's going on with your system. So keep the users informed about what's going on, what page are they on, what step of a process are they on. So kind of the general rule of thumb is if somebody leaves their screen up and walks away and comes back 10 minutes later, or somebody else walks up to the computer without having been there, they should be able to tell just by looking exactly what's going on. What step of a process you're on, whether you're dealing with an error or dealing with a normal case. Labeling the steps of the interface in the pages. It also encompasses things like providing appropriate feedback about what's happening inside the system. So what is the system doing, how the input is being interpreted, things like that. I did a consulting job once for a company, which I'm not allowed to name, which had a really awful product. I'm going to use a lot of examples. It was surprisingly poor. And they brought me in to give them some feedback on what to fix, and I gave them this really long list, and they said, okay, thanks anyway, we're not going to do any of that. So not too surprisingly, the company soon went bankrupt. And part of the reason was that they violated so many of these guidelines and had a really poor user interface. You can't really get away with that anymore. The first example that I'm using is that they had a grouping mechanism. And like most products, PowerPoint has grouping. But when you tried to ungroup objects, it popped up a very short message to say, really ungroup? And expected you to say yes or no. And most people said yes because they hit the ungroup command. Well, what the system didn't tell you is that there were all these properties that had been attached to a group. And that when you said ungroup, it would throw away all those properties. And furthermore, they hadn't bothered to implement undo. And so the reason that this falls into this category is that the ungroup confirmation dialog did not say any of that information. It didn't say this was not an undoable operation. It didn't say there's all these properties on the group that are going to be lost if you continue. It was completely silent about all of these issues. There's a similar kind of problem with PowerPoint, actually, is if you group things in PowerPoint, guess it won't let me group those. Nope, can't group those. Wonder why not. Nope, can't group those either. Okay, probably let me group those. So if we group things in PowerPoint, oh, come on. Then you can attach behaviors to the group like animations, so I can make it fade in. So now at runtime, they'll fade in. If I ungroup them, sure enough, it will just completely lose that animation. And luckily, this operation is undoable, which is one reason they don't have to write a confirmation. But it's really annoying, even if you regroup. I don't think the animation comes back. Right, so they just appear here. So this is another case where you lose information, and you might think that that would be a good thing to provide feedback on. People might not notice that. But at least in this case, it's undoable. In this product, they hadn't bothered to implement undo for this. It was usually undo, but for this particular operation, they just were lazy and hadn't gotten around to it yet. The next one is match between the system and the real world. This is a bunch of different requirements around the vocabulary that you're using and the mechanisms in order to try to communicate what's going on. So the first one is to try to use terminology that's in the user's language. So this is for error messages and prompts and labels. They should all use terms that your users are familiar with, especially avoiding computer technology, computer words, right? So you'd never say array out of bounds in an error message. You would say, I can't handle more than 255 items, or whatever the user is actually entering. Another much less important, smaller item is to use the language from the user's perspective. So things like you have bought as opposed to we have sold you. And this is very common in web pages, that there's confusion about who's talking, right? And so, special sale for you is fine, but we are now selling you this. Which we is that? Is it Amazon? Is it some other company? So talking from the user's perspective tends to be more clear and less confusing. Try to use common words that the users are going to know and not avoiding techno jargon. There's all sorts of examples. Here we've got a mail server query results for Hartson send invalid spawn ID 6 while executing send to spider file gen query pass line 31, right? So this is completely useless to almost everybody who would read it. And maybe some low-level programmer would need this information, so it's perfectly reasonable to put it in some invisible log somewhere. But displaying this for people just doesn't make any sense. Nobody's going to know what a spawn ID is just to start off, much less all the codes in the background. Error messages and feedback should refer to the objects that users actually are referring to and hiding all the details internally. So here's a printer error. There was an error writing to LPT1 : for the printer HP LaserJet 6P, right? So why do they even bother with this LPT1 thing? It's an old-fashioned Windows mechanism that, or Unix, I don't even remember, which nobody uses anymore. And the real problem is the printer is out of paper. Please add more paper. So there wasn't any need for all of this detailed internal stuff. They could just say, The printer, HP LaserJet 6P, is out of paper. At least it told you that important information, but why is it hidden among all this jargon? And there are a variety of other places this comes up, is allowing full-length names. So names of things in the real world have spaces in them. They have special characters. There was a long time before files were allowed to have spaces in them. And you still aren't allowed to have certain characters in your file names, even though there's a perfectly good way of putting quotes around them so that it doesn't interfere with things. So in your system, if you're making people come up with names of things, there's no particular reason not to let them use full names. Names that if you're going to make people invent names, let them use names that are meaningful to them. Another example, there's a message that came up in the system that said, hit any key to continue, and they got all sorts of calls to their help center. What were people asking? Right, there is no key on my keyboard labeled any. What do I do now? So if they had said hit the space bar, hit the return key or the enter key, right, then everybody would have known what to do. They thought they were being more flexible, and then people got confused because nobody could find the key that they were talking about. The next one, user control and freedom. This is a variety of requirements around things like having a cancel button. So you always want to let people abort things while they're doing them, all the way up until the last minute. And then even after they do something, ideally there'll be some way of undoing it. Right? And this has really disappeared on the web and in mobile phones. So it's really a shame. It certainly had gotten to the point in desktop interfaces where virtually every operation was cancelable and undoable. Probably people don't know this, but under Windows, if you're dragging a window and you change your mind, so say I start scrolling and I decide I don't want to scroll, do people know how to tell it, never mind, I don't want to scroll? Well, one way is to move really far away. Oh, no, I guess that doesn't work anymore. Sometimes that works. But another way that always works is to hit the escape key. Oh, that doesn't work. Huh. Okay, so they broke that. Used to work that you could hit escape. Let's see if that still works for Windows. Yeah, so it works for Windows. If you're changing a window size, and I change my mind about it, if you hit the key labeled escape, then it aborts that operation. And it similarly works with buttons like this. Well, buttons like this you can always pull away and then it won't do it. Everyone probably knows that. Same with menus. If I have one of these and I pull away, then it doesn't do anything. But you can also use that. I'm surprised they took that out of scroll bars. Let's try something else. Nope, that doesn't work anymore. I think some of these even work on the Macintosh, that you can hit the escape key to abort. Certainly it works in text fields. So if we go to the web, go away. What's something good with a text field? Yeah, so on these pop-ups, if you can obviously move outside, which usually works to abort, but you can also hit the escape key. So ideally, the escape key would work everywhere. One reason people don't is because most people don't even know about it. In this when you're in the process of buying something from a website, or if you're going through multiple pages, setting settings or something for a camera or whatever, then almost always there'll be a back button to go to the previous page. And obviously all browsers have a back button. And in the early days of the web, websites used to always say, don't use the back button from the browser, that'll just get me confused. And the airline websites used to, have all these warnings that if you hit the back button, then they would be confused and it would try and give you 2 outbound flights and no return flights and things like that. Most of that has been resolved by now, but as the web page designer, you have to insist that your engineers make sure that the back button does something reasonable. So if you're on page 3 of a 5-page process and people use that back button instead of your back button, it should still let you, redo whatever was on the previous page. So that's, another way that you can tell to go back is this, most websites have something in this general area that's called breadcrumbs, which kind of shows you what you're doing and what step you're on. And that also is another way to let you go back to the previous step. And let's add this to my cart. Proceed to checkout. So now, I guess I won't bother. You have multiple steps there. Here's a survey that we're working on, which also has a next button, but we also have previous buttons. All right, so there's lots of different ways that you can let people abort what they're doing and try again. So the goal is to help people when they make errors or they get confused about what they're doing or just simply change their mind. And pretty much you have to assume that everybody can make errors. In the product that we were talking about before, had text fields that let you type things in them, but they were in what's called pending delete. I don't know if you've noticed that. The calendar is one of the annoying things to do that if I have a new appointment, and I have an appointment, and then I have a location, say Wien Hall. If I click out and I click back in, by default, the whole name is selected. Right? That's called pending delete. As soon as I type something, it'll delete everything that's there. And so this happens to me all the time as I put in the street name and then I click away and then I click back in to put in the city, and instead of putting in the city, it just deletes everything. This is called pending delete. And so if you don't want to delete that, you have to click again. So you have to do 2 clicks in order to avoid. But double clicking means word select. So you don't want to double click because that's something different again. So what happened in this product is that there was a field called something like ID, product ID, which had this long complicated ID in it, which it checked to make sure you had entered correctly. But unfortunately, that field, when you clicked into it, was a pending delete field. So if you accidentally deleted the contents, then they went away. And the system was really stupid, and it checked to make sure that you always had valid data in that field, and that field was not allowed to be empty. So if you accidentally deleted the old value, there was no way to get back to it. And people ended up basically closing down the application because they couldn't figure out a way of restoring this field to a valid ID, because who has their product IDs memorized? The next one is consistency and standards, and this is actually surprisingly pervasive and also surprisingly hard. And one of the reasons is that there are lots and lots of things that you might want to be consistent with and consistent about. So some of the standard things that you have to be careful about is making sure that the same command has the same effect everywhere, and it has the same name everywhere. So kind of the obvious ones are copy and paste. Cut always deletes something and puts it in the clipboard, and you should be using that word everywhere. If you have a way of deleting things, you should call it the same thing everywhere, probably delete. You shouldn't call it remove in some places and delete in other places. Seems really obvious, but it's surprisingly hard. And one of the reasons that consistency is often hard is that any real interface is being done by a large team. And so how are you going to make sure everybody on the team does things exactly the same way? Sometimes you need style guidelines. Sometimes you need a style or user interface guru or user interface owner or something like that, a single person who has to check through everything to look for consistency problems. And there are other things that consistency is relevant to. First of all, location. So where is the button? I was just actually reviewing an interface this morning where the continue button moved all over the place, right? The back button was always in the top left, but the continue button was sometimes on the right, sometimes on the bottom, sometimes in the top left. And it was kind of, the designer just thought it would be pretty in different places. And so, as a user, it's when you get to a screen, you're not sure, when I'm supposed to hit this continue button and whether maybe it means something different if it's in different parts of the page. Where is the back button? Where is the home button? Where do I look for certain elements? If you let the person type in their address, it should always be in the same kind of field with the same kind of labels and so forth. One of the advantages of consistency is it helps you give the user the right mental model, that they kind of are comfortable because they know how things work in one part of the interface and that they can apply those exact same rules that they've memorized or they figured out in other parts. Size, location, coloring, wording. We talked about before that users will try to assign meaning to almost anything in your user interface. So if you were writing a novel and every character was described exactly the same way, that would be really boring, right? Or if the person was described in the same way in different chapters, that would still be kind of boring. So if you're, trying to write something that's entertaining or engaging, you might say, I should use different words or different descriptions in different places. In the user interface, that's a terrible idea. Because as soon as you use a different word or a different description, people are going to think it's somehow different than the one they had before. So if you wanted to have the same operation in multiple places, it should be identical. Same name, same look, same font, same colors. Everything needs to be the same. The same order, sequencing means the same order. So if you let people do things in one order in one part of the interface, it should do it in the same order everywhere else as well. This example of purple is a tough one. I was consulting for a different company. This wasn't the one we talked about before, which was operations. They controlled factories, and they built software for controlling factories. And they had this really hard problem that they had just bought another company. And every company in the world uses red for bad and green for fine and yellow for things in the middle. But these two companies had different meanings for purple, right? And so purple, it's not obvious where purple should go here. You say, well, this should be orange. People rarely use orange because in lots of monitors, orange looks identical to red. So it's really hard to pick an orange that doesn't look like red or yellow. And similarly, what goes between between green and yellow, yellowish green, there's really not a good name for that. This particular company had picked purple. So how many people think purple should be between really bad or between red and yellow? How many think purple should be here? One. How many people think purple should be here? Oh, come on, you have to vote. We'll do this again. Everyone has to vote. Purple, it's going to be one of these places, so half of you are going to be right. Purple between red and yellow. Okay, looks like about 2/3 maybe. And purple between yellow and green. Yeah, about 1/3 and 2/3. So it turned out that they had these two products and they did it in the opposite way. right? And so half of the company was arguing we need to keep it the way people are used to, because otherwise, when they get version 7 of their product after using version 6, then all of a sudden Purple will go from something really bad to something not so bad, or vice versa. So that was a perfectly reasonable argument. We should be consistent with the way people used to work. On the other hand, they had bought these two companies because they were going to integrate the product. And so you simply can't have it that on one page of the same product, Purple is here, and on a different page of the same product, Purple is here, right? Because that would be completely inconsistent internally. So they had to pick one, and what they ended up picking was that it went here. And so, it was kind of arbitrary because they had to do it one way or the other. But this is an example where consistency, even just this one goal, this one guideline by itself, isn't necessarily that easy. And I've often been in meetings where people will be arguing about how to design something, and both groups will say their position is right based on consistency. So how do you achieve a consistency? As I mentioned, following a standard obviously helps. One way you can do that on the web is have a small group or single person define styles with a cascading style sheet, CSS styles. And then all of your implementers can just use those IDs, and then things will come out in the right way. Sometimes you might have to have an additional style guide that says how things should work and so forth. In this product that I was mentioning before, they had part names with a fairly complex internal structure. And weirdly, in two different parts of their interface, they named them differently. So in one part, it was quote F number 1 dot C number 1. And in a different part, it was quote F number 1 quote comma quote C number 1 quote. All right, and so there was no reason to do it differently. They just had different programmers who had done it at different times, and they decided, each one got to decide how to do it. And then another example that we've talked about a bunch of times is the word copy has to do what computer people expect copy to do if you have a computer product, which is make a copy in an invisible buffer. Number 5 is error prevention. So this is a goal of helping people avoid making errors in the first place. And you'll see that a subsequent one is helping people after they've made errors. But ideally, you will guide people so they don't make any errors. And the first way to typically do this is selection rather than entry. So using pop-up menus, using little pop-up calendars to let people click on dates that they want, graying out things that people can't do. So when you have a pop-up date picker, if you don't want people to pick dates in the past, then you should gray them out so that those aren't available, things like that. Let people, if people have provided input and you need them to clarify it, then giving them choices instead of making them retype is often useful. So if you go into Expedia and say, I want to fly to Columbus, it'll say, well, we have a lot of Columbuses in the United States. Which one do you actually want to fly to? And so then you have to actually pick, typically one of these choices. I don't know why Boston is considered Columbus, but obviously Columbus, Georgia, and Columbus, Ohio, Minneapolis. There are lots of Columbuses that have airports. Auto fill-in that you get with Google and most interfaces is a good way of helping prevent errors. If people are starting to type something incorrectly, typically the autocorrect will fix it for them and help them avoid errors, because people would then pick one of the choices. It's tricky to implement that correctly, but now there's fairly reasonable number of libraries that can help you with that. Confirmation is another way to prevent errors. So if you find that people are typing things incorrectly, then you can say, it seemed like you entered this. That's not legal right now. or you seem to be wanting to delete all your files. Are you sure that's what you want to do? That's not undoable. Obviously, your confirmation dialogues have to be clear and understandable so people know what it is that they're answering. Another way to avoid errors is avoiding modes. So mode is where the same thing does different things depending on what part of the interface you're at, or what part of the system. And obviously, some modes are inevitable. And what does clicking the mouse button do? Well, that's not well defined. It does all sorts of different things depending on what your cursor is on top of. Right? Sometimes it might select something. Sometimes it might delete something. Sometimes it might cause some other action. So you can't really say what the mouse button does, but it should be pretty clear, say, what the right mouse button does. It pops up a context menu. What does the delete key on the keyboard do? Well, it deletes whatever's selected. Right? So some of these things should be the same no matter what mode you're in. Other things might be very different. So, what does the end key do, or the down arrow, or just typing a letter? And so to the extent that there are modes, then you need to make them really visible so the user can tell what's going on. So if a big dialog box pops up in the middle of your screen that says something, then probably clicking on outside of that will beep or fail to work. That should be really visible. There's this classic old-fashioned example about modes. And this was back in the days of command lines. So hopefully everyone's familiar with command lines or the DOS prompt, or I forget what's the Macintosh call it?
Dominant.
Yeah, right. So in the days where that was all you could do, there was a message called daytime, which would give you the time of day, because you didn't have clocks on your computer all the time. And so people used to type that a lot. But there was a mail program where you went into mail, and then single keys had specific meanings. And so when you typed daytime to the mail program, it meant delete all. And this was a pretty good program, so it asked for confirmation. So then you said yes. And then the T didn't do anything. And then you said insert me. And so then you would say, oh my God, I just deleted all my mail. How do I get out of it? Let me hit undo. So it did have undo, but it only had one level undo. So you'd hit undo, and that would get rid of this email that had me in it. So then you're back to right before the last operation, and you had no email messages left. All right, so this is a classic old-fashioned example of how bad modes are, and one of the reasons we don't have interfaces like this anymore. But there's still lots of good examples of cases where the same operation, the same key strokes, the same clicking does very different things. The next one is recognition rather than recall. And the idea of this is to try and make everything visible so that you can select from what you can see rather than having to remember things. And there are lots of different dimensions from this. One is that anytime the user has to select from a small set of objects or a small set of values, they should be able to pick it from menus. Certainly, that's how pretty much every web page works with things like states. Menus all over the place in conventional interfaces and on the phone so that you can tap on things. This especially is relevant for phones since you don't want to have people typing on phones very much. But menus can't be too long, or else people have to kind of remember what command they're looking for because they have to search through these long menus to find them. Autofill-in is another way that you can help people recognize what they want. Simple thing is whenever you are letting people type in something, that the prompt should tell them what the format is, what are the choices that they're picking from. A really good example of this that you may or may not have noticed is that if you're printing slides or pages, most of the time you can give different ranges. So in PowerPoint, you can say 1, 3, 5 through 12 with a hyphen. So there's this little thing here, which you probably never noticed, but if you wanted to print a range, right there in front of you in the prompt. It says how to do it. And just with a few characters, it gives you a very good understanding of all the different options for which slides you want to print. So this is a great example of how prompting can help you understand, obviously, things like the number of copies. It's a text field. You can actually type into it, but you could also just click buttons. And other things here like collate, nobody really understands what order your texts are coming out, so this icon helps you understand what the difference between having that box checked or not means. And there are lots of other examples throughout here of kind of giving you the information you need so that you can just recognize it. Anytime you find somebody writing things down on a slip of paper and then typing them back into the computer later, that's a significant failure, right? Or even if they have to do copy and paste across pages of the interface, then you know that something's not working right. And that happens all the time. People are writing things on sticky notes, or they have sticky notes around their computer to try to remind themselves of some operation or some value that they need a lot or whatever. So anytime people have to retype something, that's generally showing some violation of this rule. This also applies to things like having generic rules throughout the interface for how it operates. So if I have to remember that on one page I do delete and on a different page I do remove, then that's a recall problem, right? And if I can just do the same thing everywhere, then that's another advantage. And then the final example here is, if you remember from the first lecture, there was a display on the scope that had the altitude, and the user was required to do math in their head to remember the old value and compare it to the new value to see if the airplane was going up or down. So that's another case where this rule is being violated, that we're requiring the user to do a mental computation based on recall rather than just showing them the value and let them recognize it. And everybody in the class came up with great examples of how to let them recognize whether the plane was going up or down using colors or icons or even just showing the number. It would be a better design to let people follow this guideline. The next one is flexibility and efficiency of use. And so the idea of this one is that your experts should be able to do things very efficiently. You want to have ways of letting people do things in an easy way if they know what they're doing. One example of this is having shortcuts. For web pages, you might have bookmarks that let you jump right into the middle of your interface, or for products. In regular menus, there are command keys. And in old-fashioned Windows, it used to tell you what those are, and that was also in the Macintosh, that along with every menu item used to be what accelerator key would let you do that. And nowadays, we don't have anything like that anymore. And on this right-click menu, there are shortcut commands. Everybody knows the shortcut commands for things like copy and paste and cut, Control X, Control V, but it doesn't show you what they are anymore. They used to. If you hit the Alt key a few times, Windows will actually show you some of the shortcuts. I might not have noticed that. So now if I type a G, it will do custom slideshow, I presume. I guess it was in a different place. Let's see, home. G is on design. K is on transitions. So now I get to the transitions. So this is a set of shortcuts that you could theoretically memorize as an expert if you did these kind of things a lot. And other menus, let's try. This one still has menus. So this is, more old-fashioned kind of menus where the commands show you the controls that will operate them, so that if you wanted to learn which particular keystrokes do these things, it shows you these. And so some of them are, easy to find. So that's the general idea of shortcuts, command keys. Many websites, if you make a bookmark into the middle of the website and then try and use that bookmark, it doesn't work. And that's because a lot of websites try and encode a lot of information in the URL, like the session ID and the times and other kinds of information, so that if you try to reuse that location again or that URL again, it won't work, which is really very counter to this, this requirement that you want to let people jump into the middle of your website and find things again. Another example are, if you logged in and you've entered your shipping address, your shipping information, it should remember that so you don't need to enter it again later. That's another expert feature kind of thing where it will remember sets of features. And even as simple as having good default values. How many items do people usually want to buy from an e-commerce site? Right? It's almost always one. So it's really dumb not to have one as a default value for quantity, because then everybody has to be inefficient and type in one all the time. And occasionally you might want two or three, but that's really rare, so that you should always provide good defaults. Number 8 is aesthetic, that's hard to say, aesthetic and minimalist design. And this is kind of all of the kinds of things that we talked about in the design lecture, using good colors, having good icons, having good layouts on the screen. The role of design, one of the roles of design is to focus the user's attention on the right things and make them do things in the right order. So what should they be paying attention to on this interface right now? Having good grouping, so that items that go together are grouped together in boxes or in sections of the interface. And I've often seen this violated where there's a whole row of data entry boxes, and it's not clear what order you're supposed to do these in or which ones go with which. Sometimes you even see this on paper forms. I was just doing one before where it wasn't clear which of these boxes I was supposed to put my name into. Balance and white space. Maintain display inertia is the idea that, again, things should be in the same place on different screens. So if you have a logo somewhere on your interface and it wanders around on different screens, then people are going to find that distracting and annoying. Whereas if it stays in exactly the same place as you switch screens, then things won't have to change that aren't relevant. White space is part of your design, so you should consider not just trying to pack as much information as possible on each screen, but actually using the white space so that the pieces that are there are appropriately grouped and look neat and organized. Often, novice designers will try and put boxes around everything, and that's often completely unnecessary. If you just pull things apart far enough, then it'll be really obvious without the extra elements of having lots of lines and things. Another kind of novice mistake is to use too many colors and too many fonts. And if you remember from the design lecture, she recommended no more than 2 fonts. Helvetica or sans serif for headlines and for reading on screen, and a serif font for most of your content. And similarly for colors, if you need to have colors to designate certain things, make sure you pick them from a fairly small set. And also you should have redundant encoding. Anybody here colorblind? Yeah, one, yeah. So, and probably the guy with the vision impaired who sometimes attends. It turns out about 8% of males in general are colorblind. And it typically is red-green colorblind, which, since, as we talked about before, most people use red and green to represent good and bad. So if both of them pretty much look the same as the same amount of gray, then you're completely losing those people and they'll miss what's important. So typically you'll have, on the other hand, color is very salient. It's very easy to see for everybody else. So you don't want to say, okay, some people are colorblind, so we won't use color at all. Instead, you should say, we're going to use colorblind colors appropriately, but for the colorblind, we're going to have redundant coding. So maybe things that are red also have an asterisk, or also have some other icon associated with them, or something like that, so that people who are colorblind can still understand the content. Another thing to do is to switch your monitor to black and white and make sure that the colors look different in black and white. And you can use intensity. So dark colors will look blacker than lighter colors. And then obviously you want to avoid low contrast. So this is one of the problems in the Apple design guidelines all the time, that people say, oh, I should have white with light gray as the text, and then nobody can read it. And this is a bad example from a commercial product where they'd simply used the wrong color font, right? If these words had been white, then it wouldn't be any problem to read them. But because they just decided all the words are black, and then they had this really dark background, nobody can read that. So independent of, I don't know why why Nielsen grouped these together, because they're really different. But it's called aesthetic and minimalist design. So the minimalist design is trying to eliminate things. So nobody reads much anymore. If you have more than one line of instructions, people will probably ignore the second lines. So the general guideline is to try and reduce the kinds of things that you have on your screen at one time. So how do you do that? Well, identify what's really needed, what you really want people to deal with. I've often been consulting for companies that would say, oh, well, that's kind of complicated. We'll just make sure the manual makes it clear, or we'll have some help text to make it clear, and that just never works. So one strategy is, if you find something too complicated to explain to somebody else, then redesign it to try and avoid that complexity. And so that's always a lot more challenging than just trying to figure out how to explain it. But in the end, you end up with a much better product if you can eliminate the complexity or figure out a way of having very short prompts that make it more understandable. You should avoid extraneous pictures and information, things that aren't needed. In this product that I keep picking on, they had a menu item called Show Cartouche, and I asked them what that meant, and nobody knew. None of the engineers who were there knew what this meant. And eventually I found out that some customer a long time ago had actually asked for this feature, and they had put it in special for this one customer. And then they just left it in grayed out for everybody else because they implemented it once. But nobody else could make it turn not gray because it was a feature that nobody had actually wanted or paid for. But still, it was in every menu, and it had to be in the manual because it was in the menu. And the trainers were always getting questions about it, and the support calls would occasionally come in and saying they can't figure out how to get this to be re-enabled, even though nobody particularly knew what it meant. So, why not just eliminate it if it's not going to be relevant to people? On the other hand, if there was some chance that people would actually want this, and so maybe you wanted to leave it in so the salesman would get calls, like the freemium idea where you give people free stuff and then have all these menu items that they can't pick until they pay you more money. That's another reason that you might have items that are grayed out that people can't figure out how to operate. But to the extent that it's useless or optional, then it makes more sense to leave it out. In general, you want to have fewer options in menu choices. This, it's kind of contrary to the Windows and Macintosh design, where there's more and more ways of doing any single operation. So as we saw in, in PowerPoint, there are probably 3 or 4 different ways to invoke every operation, right? You can click on a menu somewhere up here, so copy and paste and so forth. You can right-click on the item and you get it. Many items are also available from this, from some keyboard shortcut or this alternate key shortcut. So that's 4 ways off the top of my head. Anybody know of any others? There are probably more, right? And so that's kind of the opposite of minimalist design, that there are all these different ways of achieving exactly the same result. And the consequence of that, you might say, well, that's always better because experts can have shortcuts. But it also means that experts have to plan. They have to decide in their head, which way am I now going to do stuff? And you probably come up with this as well. If you're in text edit mode and your cursor is here and you want it to be over there, then maybe you use the arrow keys. And sometimes you'll actually pick up the mouse, and maybe you'll have a mouse and a trackpad, and sometimes you use one and sometimes you use the other. So as an expert, you're kind of always doing this problem solving, which is completely irrelevant to the task you're actually trying to do of writing a slide or writing a document. You're having to spend cognitive effort picking a strategy to do for everything, and that always slows you down. Okay. And, a lot of people will add pictures and other kinds of information to pages, and sometimes pictures are really useful. If you're on an e-commerce site, you pretty much can't sell anything unless people can see pictures of it. On the other hand, a decoration that's a picture or a giant logo or a picture of a person, holding your product or whatever, does not really help give any useful information. Number 9 is to help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. So errors are inevitable, even though you're going to try and reduce them using the strategies from before. But it's very important that once people are in an error situation, that you help them understand what's going on and recover. Some experts have recommended that errors actually should be viewed as a way of teaching users about what they're confused about. So nobody gets into an error situation on purpose. And typically they've done an error. I mean, it might be a simple typo, in which case there's, just you want to help people get out of it efficiently. But a lot of times people get into error situations because they're generally confused about what's allowed or what the system will do or what state they're in. And so in that case, you really need to be clear about what their misperception is or their confusion is and why things don't work the way that they expect. Error messages have to be clear, using languages that people understand, no codes. So I just had the problem the other day that my cable box is saying error 25, and I can't figure out why it's refusing to record onto the disk. I have plenty of space, blah, blah, blah. I have no idea what to do about this, so I go to Google and type in error 25. And sometimes it's helpful, right? But that's ridiculous. There's plenty of screen space. I've got this whole TV in front of me. Why isn't it telling me what the problem is and what I can do about it? So anytime you have the opportunity to give a complete error message, you need to do that and not use codes. Also, be precise. So syntax error is what compilers used to tell programmers all the time, but there's never any reason to use that kind of language for end users, right? Even if you have some complicated field, right, that they're supposed to type something interesting into, you should never say syntax error because, they probably don't have a syntax error. It's not. If you think of syntax error as English, that means you have a noun-verb, confusion. That would be a syntax error, or stuff from an English class, and that's not what's really going on at all. You need to help the user understand how to fix the problem, not just what the error is, right? So if you said, illegal format for a date, well, that would be really clear what the problem is, but what is the right format for a date, right? So without telling them how to fix the problem, you're just making them guess about what could be the problem. Another example about being specific, I don't think I have that. Another example about being specific is being unable to write to a DIS file. Okay, so you're trying to save a document, and it says can't save file. Is that on here? I must have that somewhere. It's probably coming up later. Yeah, it's here. So in this product, it said can't save file. Why not? Right? What are some reasons why file saving might fail?
No space.
No space, right? You're trying to save to a disk, and the disk is full, or a memory stick, or whatever. That's a classic one, yeah?
Maybe there is already a file with the same name.
Right, so there's already a file with the same name, and you're not allowed to overwrite it, or it should ask you if you want to overwrite it. What else? There are lots of reasons why saving might fail.
Permissions to write in the directory.
Right, you might have no permission if it's a network directory or something. Only certain people are allowed to write to it. What else? Broken?
Not work.
What?
For some reason.
Yeah, so the device may be broken, especially this happens with network connections. Your network may be down. What else? Missing a few obvious ones. Yeah, you might not have specified a target destination. What else?
Extension is incorrect.
Right, so wrong file name. That's actually a much more general problem. You might have an illegal character in the file name, in which case it won't let you save it. What else? What really obvious one everyone's missing? Write protected media, right? So you've got you're trying to save to a DVD or something that's write protected, or you have a memory stick with a switch on it that you can turn off writing. So it's not unusual to have read-only medium that you can save to. So in this product, so does the operating system know why you can't save, right? So this information has to be known by the operating system. Otherwise, it did all these tests to make sure it could save the file. And that information is actually passed to your application. And so this is just the programmers being lazy and not reflecting this information that they've been given from the low levels to the user error messages, right? And so what this basically is telling people, invalid type? Yeah. So that's another good reason that, you're trying to save the wrong kind of file or something. This message is basically telling your users, haha, I know what's wrong, you have to figure it out, I'm not going to tell you, right? And no one really likes this kind of guessing game. So that's kind of the same thing with syntax error and some of these other really vague messages. Be polite and not accusing. So fatal error, okay? Because you made this error, you're now going to die, right? That's what fatal error means, right? So that's not true. Maybe the program has to die, but it doesn't actually die because it's going to come back to life the next time you invoke it, right? And so, something a lot more polite and positive, I'm sorry, there's been a serious error, this program has to close, right? Similarly, blame the system, not the user. Illegal command, you're now going to jail because you did something illegal, right? That's not going to happen, right? If you blame the system, it's unrecognized command. I don't really know what you're talking about, right? It just sounds so much more pleasant and polite to say, I'm a dumb system, I don't know what you want. Humor or snide comments seem funny to the programmer, but they rarely seem funny to users. The user's in a bad mood. They made an error, right? They're not succeeding at what they're trying to do. This is rarely a time where they're going to be amenable to jokes, right? Or to amusing situations. So you'll see I have lots of examples of programmers trying this. Another thing is if they get it over and over again, everybody knows a joke is not funny the second time, right? And so even though the programmer only had to write this once, if users are seeing this over and over again, they're really going to get annoyed, right? As opposed to a very helpful, polite error message that says, I'm sorry, that still doesn't work. Obviously, you want to make error recovery easy. So it doesn't help to tell people exactly what to do if it's pretty hard or not possible, right? And it's sometimes helpful to have multiple levels of errors. So there's sometimes where you have an error and then a little question mark, where you can click on that if you need more information about why things are going wrong or what the situation is. So I collect lots of error messages, so I'd be delighted if you guys send me some good examples of things going wrong. So these are almost all web pages. So this was Pittsburgh Cultural Trust downtown, which has a lot of great plays and things like that. At this point, apparently, there was no space left on device. And then they give me this ridiculous URL, or file. It's actually a file name, /var/www/satellite/releases 2015, blah, blah, blah. And then no such file or directory, and then there's this URL which goes way over here, and then wraps around, back over to here, right? And so obviously the designers had not planned for this error message to be on the screen at this time, and they just got this over and over again, right? So, the web designer was not planning for the device to fill up, but, that's perfectly reasonable kind of error that it seems like it would be reasonable to come up with a little more reasonable error message rather than showing kind of these internal details. And there's also some interesting research that shows that this is a really big security hole, that when you expose these internal details to customers, then bad guys can really exploit this in order to do some real damage to your systems. This is one a colleague just sent me a few weeks ago. Generic error. The following section is intended to aid store developers in debugging problems on the sample store. So this was even not supposed to ever be seen by users, right? And there's supposed to be some details down here, but nothing else appeared, right? So somehow the Costco website got into a state where it's showing these internal pages, and it, after an online test, the screen displays, congratulations, you are finished. I didn't quite catch that. Go away. After online test, the screen display, congratulations, you are finished. That doesn't seem like an error.
It might be like you are finished.
Oh, I see, like you're dead? That kind of finished? Yeah. Right, so you have to be sensitive to different meanings. So this is an example of trying to be funny. So this is Fandango, error 500, unable to process your request. What does that mean? Sorry, sweetie, but something has plumb gone wrong. An unexpected problem occurred during the processing of your request. Please apply one of the following. Right? And so, that's kind of, cute and funny, maybe, if you like their advertising campaign with these guys. But if you start to see this a bunch of times, you'd get kind of annoyed at it. So here's an example where they never got around to filling in this placeholder. Their friendly error message is going to go here, but apparently not. Didn't seem so friendly when I got it. And this is another example of being vague. This number cannot be registered in the uPromise service at this time. So that implies that maybe it would work some other time, which actually is not true. Because either you entered your information inaccurately, or you already registered this number, or this number is not valid for registration. Do you think it knows which one of the three that is? Please check your information and try submitting again. Well, obviously submitting it the same information again is not going to work. It turns out the problem had nothing to do with any of this. The way the Giant Eagle was working at this point with uPromise was that the Giant Eagle ID actually had another set of digits, and my wife and I had cards with different numbers, but the same account. And so when I typed in my number, basically it was that you were already registered, but I hadn't registered this number, which I knew to be true. I'd registered this account. So it was really very confusing. We actually had to call the store to ask them what was going on. So, the reason to have a lot of these things working correctly is because otherwise you end up with calls to your service center or people failing. Here's another tranche ID, invalid tranche ID specified. Obviously, nobody has a tranche ID. Nobody even knows what that means. So that should never be displayed to people. So Yahoo and most websites do a much better job these days that when you get an error, it shows you what's wrong up here, as well as typically making it clear where you forgot information. This is another, I think, kind of bad example where Hipmunk told you couldn't find it. And the final one is help and documentation. So this includes kind of everything that you have to help people understand what to do, the help text, the labels, any documentation that you have. If you have a manual, like if you're doing a consumer electronic product, you probably still need to write a manual. So people pretty much expect things to be walk up and use, self-explanatory. You really can't get away with requiring people to learn stuff. The general rule is help doesn't. Don't assume you can get people around complexities by giving them help. One strategy I found really useful in companies that have tech writers to write their manuals is to actually empower those tech writers to be part of the design team. So usually they're English majors and they're often some low status part of the building and they're not really authorized to talk to the product designers. But they are surprisingly knowledgeable about what's hard to use in your system because they had to try and figure out a way of explaining it. And so by actually empowering your tech writers to be contribute to the design and to fixing up these problems really is helpful. And they're also really good with this one to help with high quality writing. Making sure all of the sentences in your system make sense, that they're clear, that there's no ambiguities. Obviously, consistency is important here as well, so that you use the same words in your documentation as you use on the screen. The documentation itself is a user interface in some sense. Your help system is a user interface. So if you have a complex help system, now you're making it hard for people to find out information. There was a study done quite a long time ago that the help system was so hard to use that they ended up doing a usability evaluation like we're doing in this class and cut the time to use the help system almost in half as a result of improving the interface for the help system, not to mention the system it was trying to help you about. For homework 5, you're going to be doing a heuristic analysis of other people's systems, and no one is required to do help as part of their implementation. You may remember that was not one of the things we told you to do. And so when you're evaluating somebody else's system, if you say, there is no help for this system, or the help button doesn't actually work, right? That's dumb. That's a silly thing to say. People were not supposed to write help. So if you use number 10 as one of your heuristics and say that your colleague's system didn't implement the help, that's pretty unhelpful as a kind of feedback. And just in general, we said this. It's actually 6. I'm going to fix that. The template is very similar to the one that you used before. So it has the same columns and so forth. And we're going to be looking to see to what extent you are producing helpful and meaningful heuristics. This is boring. Yep, I really wanted to open it. That's why I asked to open it. Well, that was a mistake. So, so the important thing is to try and come up with useful feedback that will help your classmates understand what they've done wrong and can fix it. All right. Well, someday my computer will come back. I think that's pretty much all of the slides anyway. This is really bizarre. Yay. Okay. So this is the template, which is also locked up. You're going to be evaluating other people, so you need to put both names here. So the name of the system being evaluated and the person who created the system being evaluated and your name, right? So there may not be a name, but you're going to have a person name, and then you need to put both of them in. And we want you to turn this assignment in the original doc. So please use Word, and please turn in the actual files, right? Because that way the TAs will have a much easier time of taking your 2 files and sending them off to the people that you're evaluating. And let's see if PowerPoint came back. I think that's pretty much it. Yeah. So here's a quick example. It's pretty much the same as before. The reference, the name of the heuristic, so this is consistency, why, scope, severity, and ways to fix it. So, you know, and then leave this one blank, and then for homework 6, you're going to fill in the yellow column about what you did about what the people said about your system, right? In this example, this is a consistency problem. It's really minor. The problem is that the button is in an inconsistent place across 2 parts of the interface. And I think it's minor because no one will have a problem with it. And one way to fix it is to move it in one of the places. So pretty straightforward. And that's the kind of thing that you're going to do for your classmates. Okay. I'll see you on Wednesday.